This is a presentation on the culture and context of the New Testament and early Christianity in the Roman world, and in particular, with looking at the letters of St. Paul and the lived experience or the lives of the first readers and hearers of those letters. This is the geographical context, that of the Roman Empire. The year 117 is there as representing the greatest extent of the Roman Empire at any point in its long history. So in other words, the empire was at this time, early in the 2nd century, at the very height of its power and influence over the known world. Much of the New Testament letters were written to places in this part of the empire, in the eastern part, which was Greek-speaking Greece itself and Macedonia, where of course St. Paul visited, Asia Minor, today Turkey, again many places visited by St. Paul, such as Ephesus and elsewhere. So this is the geographical context. And I'm interested in this presentation in the social context of the recipients of St. Paul's letter, and more broadly speaking, of the entire New Testament itself. So I am talking about sociology and demography, that is the study of populations and their dynamics, but it's ancient or historical demography, which is not an exact science by any stretch. So the sources are things like texts that have come down to us, archaeological remains such as those at Ephesus, which you can visit today, and at Pompeii in Italy and other places, funeral inscriptions from tombstones and other sources, and so on. So there's no, of course, there's no raw data in the way of, there wasn't a census, although there were localized ones. There's no empire-wide census that was taken in the way that we collect data today. So trying to reconstruct the nature of ancient populations, the people who lived in these great cities, is very inexact, but we do have some clues, and I'll be pointing to them as we proceed. So the letters of St. Paul, I don't need to go over this because it's elsewhere in the lesson material. And then the further letters, often called the general or Catholic letters, you can summarize these as the ones that are not attributed to St. Paul, and they're listed there with some possible dates of composition. In social context, Christianity first was established and took root in the ancient world and in the Roman Empire pretty much as an urban phenomenon. That is, most of the first communities and converts were established in cities. Cities such as Ephesus, Corinth, Colossae, and of course Rome itself. So scholars often speak about the social context of the New Testament and of early Christianity as being synonymous with that of the Greco-Roman city, and that's the focus of this presentation. So the last point by way of summary, the theology and worldview of those early Christian communities. Again, scholars often use the term apocalyptic sect to summarize the worldview of the early Christian community. By that is meant that the first Christians in the first few generations believed very strongly that in a cataclysmic end-of-world event that was very imminent, and we've met this already in the Olivet Discourse, so-called, from St. Mark's Gospel, chapter 13, where the language seems to indicate quite strongly that the end of all things is very close, even very much at hand, and that God may break into the theatre of everyday life and of the world as it is at any moment. And accompanied with that is the widespread belief in the imminence of the parousia, or the bodily or physical return of Christ to rule and to reign. So we meet language like, "Oh, surely I am coming soon," throughout the course of the New Testament. And there's a quote there from the first epistle of St. John. It is the last hour, just summing up that apocalyptic and eschatological belief. So the Roman city. What was a Roman city like? What did it look like? What were the physical features? Well, the place to go when considering Roman cities, ancient Roman cities, is Pompeii. And perhaps some of you have been to the ruins of Pompeii, as I have on a number of occasions, and walked around ancient Pompeii. This is a map, a diagram of Pompeii, and you can see the structure of the streets, the pattern, which is very common both in Hellenistic, that is in Greek cities, and also in Roman. So often main thoroughfares extending through the middle of the town, and then this grid pattern, which Melburnians will know and recognise, the way the CBD is laid out. These are city blocks, numbered here, such as 13, you can see here, 12, and then 11 are often called insula, that is regions or city blocks. And again, you can see this quite clearly in this photograph from above of ancient Ostia Antica. This is the ancient port of the city of Rome. And again, you can visit this today, and a lot of people don't, and they don't know it's there, or go to Pompeii but don't think about going to Ostia. But it's just as good, if not better, in terms of trying to get a feel for an understanding of what the physical landscape was like. And again, you can very clearly see this grid pattern, lots of straight lines, blocks, city blocks, and so on. Just to reinforce that, this is ancient Priene, which is in Asia, Roman Asia that is, the western coast of what is now Turkey, and again the grid pattern, which is given the name often Hippodamian, which is named after Hippodamus, who is said to have initiated this way of laying out the city. Priene, I'm showing Priene here because it's often considered the best example of a Greek city-state, the best of ancient urban planning. Unfortunately, that's Priene today. A photo I took on a visit a few years ago, not much evidence of poor old Hippodamus and his perfect grid. This is the plan of Ephesus, which has been partly excavated. Ephesus is very hilly, so you can see the gradient of the land here and here. And this is the ancient harbour. We'll say a bit more about Ephesus, but that just gives you an idea of what a plan of the city looks like. And this is it from above. And you can see here the Romans were very good at these lovely straight lines. Or this may go back to the Greek period as well. But there are the main roads, if you like, often called the Cardo, the main thoroughfare. This is the theatre, which is probably the best preserved theatre in antiquity and much visited today. But again, you can see here the grid pattern, what's left of it. These would have been houses, probably apartments as we would call them. You can see the mark they've left on the landscape. It's a satellite image, and that's the Marble Way, as it's called, the main road of Ephesus, leading down a coginated road, leading down to the Library of Celsus, which is here. Magnificent facade, two-storey, but in fact, in terms of its physical size, several stories high, using our measurements. And you can see the many tourists, many of them coming from the cruise ships. And that's what I meant by the impressive size of the facade of the library. And it's quite a fascinating diagram. It's again a plan of ancient Ephesus, and what this is showing is well, it's an example of ancient town planning. So I think town planning regulations today, such as what areas are zoned public use, areas that are zoned commercial use, and then of course areas that are zoned for housing. The same sort of principle operated in the Roman world, and the main difference is the Romans dedicated a very large percentage of the surface of the city to public or communal use. And that's shown here in this diagram in blue. So these are the public buildings, and they're often in the heart of the town. Things such as the marketplace, the theatre, and so on. The green is the commercial hub, which is that's the harbour. If you remember the previous slides, the ancient harbour, it's all silted up now, and in fact, it's the water is now some 6 kilometres away. But in ancient times, at the time the New Testament was written, there was a harbour here. And the commercial district in green, these are warehouses, shops, places where goods would be unloaded and then sold by merchants, shown in green. And the red, of course, then is the housing. So what this shows is that the space available was very, very limited. And there are a number of factors for that. Well, one, there are some natural barriers at Ephesus, so these are the city walls. Most towns were within the walls. The ground here is very high as well. So there was a need to build housing, commercial infrastructure, public buildings within those city walls, very important for defence. Not so much when the Roman Empire was at its height and had few enemies except those on the very fringes of the empire, but still the population were often kept within the walls. Everything needed to be within walking distance because there was no public transport as we know it today. So if you needed water, there needed to be a pump that you could walk to and collect your water and bring it up to where you lived. To go to the marketplace, the baths, a lot of the things that we would consider private today were often conducted in public in the Roman world, and I've got a few examples, I think, in the subsequent slides on that. So you can see we're pretty much maybe around 30% of the space within the city is given over to public buildings, maybe a little less to commercial, doesn't leave a lot for housing. In most Roman cities, only not more than 50% of the area, the physical area of the city, was given over to housing. And as if you've been to Europe, Rome itself, of course, the ancient centre of Rome, Pompeii, places like that, you'll know how vast those public spaces are and how large they often are. The marketplaces are often extensive and very large indeed. And here are just some photos of, this is the Temple of Apollo again. Temples dedicated to various gods took up a lot of space within the city. This is Ephesus still. These are the baths. These are not at Ephesus but at Miletus nearby, which was another port, the port at which St. Paul stopped on his way home on his last missionary voyage and had that tearful farewell. The baths, again, these are often outside. Sometimes they were closed over with a roof, and you bathed in public, or of course other people there. And these are the latrines at Ostia Antica, that port near Rome. And again, you can see how public that is. These are just on a street corner in full view of passers-by. That was everyday life in a Roman city. Theatres, again, public buildings, infrastructure that was very important to the communal life of the city, took up a lot of space. Sometimes they were a bit outside of the city walls. This one is at Aphrodisias, which is quite a way inland in Asia Minor or Turkey, but very well preserved. The theatre at Ephesus could seat 20,000 people, according to most estimates. Ostia, a little less. The one at Ostia is actually still used today for public performances, as are some other theatres in other places. And this is at Priene, that Hellenistic city, and this is the theatre. The reason I show this is because you can clearly see here the seats of honour, often called the bema seat. This is where the dignitaries would sit, and all the common folk were up here on the benches, on the stone. And the circus at Aphrodisias, probably the best preserved in the ancient world. Most of them, including the one at Rome, are just green fields, with most of the stone having been looted over the years, but at Aphrodisias, right up in the middle part of Turkey and quite inaccessible off the tourist route, it's still there, and you can clearly see where the chariots came in. You can see how the layout of the track, and of course the public spaces. Pompeii. This is a bench, a shop corner with a bench. This would have been a terracotta. It is a terracotta pot. Underneath here, you can't see it, but there might have been a fire, and it might have been soup or something in here, or some sort of food, kept warm by a little smouldering fire underneath. And you would arrive, possibly lean on the bench, or maybe even sit at the bench, and the shopkeeper would serve you something to eat, hot from the pot, as it were. There are many of these in Pompeii. They're the ancient equivalent of the fast food outlet. And that's just another view that's behind the counter, and you can see the pots there. You can't see this one in the foreground. Here is the one that's a little is open underneath to allow a little oven. This is the most visited attraction in Pompeii, the Lupernaria, or the Wolf's Lair, which was a brothel. I won't say any more about that. So, to ancient demography, that is the structural dynamics, the structure and dynamics of human populations. Of course, this study suffers from a profound lack of data. That is, we really don't even know the population of most of these cities. We can guess. We don't know what the population density was. Again, we can make some guesses, but we have little raw data in the way of recording of births, deaths and marriages, as happens today. So they're the usual categories into which a study of demography falls, and we'll look at some of them. We can't cover them all. So first, the population and density, a very long, much studied and debated area. A few texts give some clues as to what the population of the larger cities might have been. For instance, a writer called Galen in the 2nd century says that Pergamum, which again on that western coast of Turkey, present-day Turkey, had a population of about 180,000. Many ancient writers say that Ephesus had a population of around 200,000, and some say that Rome had as many as 1 million inhabitants in the ancient world. Now, the population density, when you factor in the small size of the city, the need for everything to be within walking space, the city walls, the natural barriers like the harbour, the hills surrounding, and so on. When you factor all of those things in together with the space taken up by public buildings, the population density of most cities in the Roman world would have probably been around 2,000 persons per hectare, which is incredibly large. This chart is giving you the population density in terms of persons per hectare for some of the largest cities today, and you can see the largest population density is at Mumbai, 389 persons per hectare. The guess of most ancient historians is that Roman cities had a population density of around 2,000 persons per hectare, so many times that of the most densely populated cities of today. So to life expectancy. Again, much of our evidence comes from inscriptions, and by inscriptions, language you're more likely to meet if you study classics and archaeology than the New Testament, although you may see it referred to from time to time. Inscriptions are generally they're not texts, not texts in the sense of writings on papyrus or codexes written on vellum or scrolls, but writing in stone. So many of them are funerary inscriptions. Sometimes they're inscriptions on public monuments, which can still be seen today. So here we have a typical inscription from a burial place in Rome, 2nd century. A lady by the name of Veturia, a married woman. She was married. She bore 6 children, but only one of them survived her. That is, she witnessed the death of 5 of her own children, and this was very common in the Roman world. Again, another inscription, funeral, Heteria Superba, who lived 1 year, 6 months and 25 days. And I put this up because even though the life expectancy was very low and mortality was very high, especially infant mortality, and notice I've spelled Ephesus wrong there, which is oh no, that might be someone's name. Sorry, Q Heterius Ephebus. The monument was, the parents were inconsolable. That is, they felt the normal grief that anyone would feel and set up this monument to their dead daughter. This is life expectancy in the Roman world. Again, much research. Several scholars studied this over an extended period of time, and this is their conclusion based on the sources that I've referred to earlier. Life expectancy at birth, on average, was very, very low, somewhere between 20 and 30 years. And most scholars will give a figure of something in the region of 25. So on average, if you were born at the time the New Testament was written, at the time St. Paul was on his missionary journeys and writing letters, if you were born at that time, your life expectancy on average was 25 years. But because that's an average, it's greatly affected by the very high rate of infant mortality. So what the graph's showing here is that for an infant under the age of 1, a very high incidence of mortality. 1 in 2 children, in fact, did not survive beyond about 10 years of age. So what the graph's actually showing is the average. If you were born, newborn, is about 25. If you survive until your first birthday, your life expectancy increases by about 10 years. If you get past year 5, you've got an even greater life expectancy, and then so on. So if you're in your 50s, you may live into old age, but of course you need to get through these critical early years. So between 0 and 1, infancy, probably about 1 in 2 infants in the Roman world did not survive beyond the first year. And again, children under the age of 10 experienced a very high rate of mortality, which, as I said, affected the average and brings it down on average to 25. It doesn't mean, of course, everyone only lived to 25. There were older people, as the graph shows. There were many reasons for the very high mortality, and some of them will be obvious: sanitation, disease, poor nutrition, lack of medical knowledge. Of course, childbirth and complications was a very significant factor. Food shortages, famine, pestilence, and so on, epidemics. So because life expectancy was very low, and due to the very high rate of infant mortality, fertility rates were very high, on average about 6 births per woman, which is far in excess of that today. So here's a graph showing the probable composition of age composition of the population in a typical Roman city. This data is actually taken from the only census data that has come down to us in a usable form from anywhere in the Roman world, and often it's just simply called the Egyptian census data, taken in the 2nd century in Egypt, of course, in a localized to one part of the empire. And this is what it showed, that there's a very high number of people in childhood. 25% of the population were aged between 0 and 9, and then it steadily decreases from there in terms of years. So only 10% of the population were aged in their 40s, less in their 50s, and so on. So in other words, a very young population. So now we come, and I'll move pretty quickly through this because I realise it's quite a lengthy presentation, but having given you a lot of data and tried to give some commentary on it, I'll now be showing a whole heap of pictures, and these are photographs that I've taken on various journeys to these parts of the world. So with all of the data in mind about population, about population density, mortality, and age composition, we're building up a bit of a picture for what the population was like, how it was composed. Here are some pictorial examples of where the people actually lived. So this is the physical environment. This is where the population lived out their lives. The first example is Herculaneum, which is very close to Pompeii on the Bay of Naples. And these are just some pictures. You can see, get a sense there for narrow laneways with buildings quite close together. And often these houses and shop fronts would have been on the bottom floor, housing 2nd, 3rd, sometimes up to 4 stories high. That's actually the modern city up there, which does bear some resemblance to the ancient one. A good example of a 2nd story, some with balcony. Again, just getting a sense of narrow streets lined by multi-story buildings. Pompeii, which many of you may well have been to. Pompeii's not really a typical Roman city. It's probably best thought of as a seaside resort for the rather wealthy. Lovely houses, beautiful mosaics, still those narrow streets which you can walk down today. And of course these would have been much higher on this side, and you can get a sense for how sort of closed in it might have been, even claustrophobic. And to Ostia Antica, the ancient port of Rome. These are probably warehouses in the commercial district. A lot of brick at Ostia. And again you can see a couple of stories. What most scholars agree, these buildings that you can see here, what are called insula, not in the sense as we met previously of regions or city blocks, but of buildings. They took that name insula because they often occupied one of those blocks in the grid pattern. These are best thought of as apartments. Think here of public housing apartments, several stories high in the ancient world, not more than 4, perhaps 5 at the most, but very densely populated. That is, lots and lots of people living mainly in single rooms. You probably only had 1, maybe 2 rooms if you were lucky, in these great big insular blocks. And you can get a sense for them there. So back to life in the city to finish with. Social class, or your quality of life very much depended on your social class. The type of big houses we see at Pompeii, which were the large private homes of the wealthy, roughly about 8% of the population were lucky enough to live in those circumstances. The vast majority, you can see here, 74%, this again is a summary of most scholars, lived in these apartment blocks or insula, these multi-storey buildings with mainly one-room apartments in which a whole family would have lived, very densely packed. And 18% had no accommodation at all. They often lived on the outskirts of the city, in the graveyards, along the city walls, sometimes in the public buildings. We can get an idea of what life was like in some of these cities from some of the ancient writers. Alciphron, who lived in Corinth, wrote, "I'm no longer continuing in Corinth, for I quickly learned of the vileness of the rich there and the wretchedness of the poor. One would bend down and pick up the lupin pods that fell from the cellar. Another would pick over breadcrumbs and scrape the rind of the pomegranates for any fruit that remained." A very vivid description of the terrible circumstances of the urban poor. Greek writer Aulus Aristides, 2nd century, he describes here a journey in towards Rome. It's a little bit metaphorical, but he's likening the landscape as he approaches it in the great city of Rome to that of mountain peaks. And what he's pointing to here are the apartment blocks which would have risen, not sure what happened there, sorry, many metres in the air. Augustine tried to limit the height to 70 feet, but it was routinely ignored. So if you read the quote, he's likening Rome as he approaches Rome to mountains covering the landscape. And these would have been the large buildings. And here's an artistic impression of what a typical apartment block might have looked like. It's a bit too idyllic, really, because the street's way too wide. You don't see streets this wide when you walk around these ruins. But it does give you a good idea of how life would have gone on. You have the shopkeepers who would have lived probably up here on the mezzanine. They come down in the morning and open the shop front, conduct their business on the street. Here's residential housing. There would have been stairs at the back. Remember, these took up a whole block, so they would have a stairway probably over the back. There were no chimneys. It's out of place there. But then these are additions. So people would often build on the second story, then build another story on that and another story on that. Their architectural and engineering skills were not that of today, so you can perhaps guess what might have happened. So what was life like in one of these insular or apartment blocks? Well, one scholar calls them a porg in slums. As I mentioned, Augustus fought a running battle to try and stop people building too high. They were often very unsound. They were often great. There was a great risk of fire. Often enterprising property developers, a lot like your slum landlords today, would get rich very quickly out of building these things and leasing out one and sometimes two-room apartments, but sometimes even a one-room apartment was sublet. There was no running water. You went down to the street to the nearest pump. There was no sanitation. You went to a latrine on the street corner or used the pot, the chamber pot, which you emptied in the morning. There was no drainage. If you were lucky, there was a bit of running water. The Romans were very good, as we know, at aqueducts and water, but certainly not to the poorer areas. To the larger houses did get a bit of running water. That didn't reach the urban poor in these insula. Cooking and heating was by brazier, a little open fire, charcoal fire usually, little light, little ventilation. You can imagine what might go wrong if you have an open fire in a four-storey building, often built rather shabbily out of wood. So Rodney Stark, who's a sociologist and historian, gives a description. The tenement Cubicles were smoky, dark, often damp and always dirty. The smell of sweat, urine, faeces and decay permeated everything. Outside on the street it was little better. Much mud, open sewers, manure and crowds. In fact, human corpses, adult as well as infant, were sometimes just pushed into the street and abandoned. It's a pretty grim overview, but it's probably quite an accurate one. Many writers, both ancient and modern, describe the streets of a Roman city as being a bit like an open sewer. And Juvenal, who was writing early 2nd century, described the tenements in Rome. And he describes here, and you can read that a little later if you like, how those on the top floor are pretty much out of luck if a fire begins, because as he says, the 3rd floor is already smoking, but you don't even know yet. Downstairs there's panic, but for those right upstairs on the higher stories, where there's only a thin layer of tiles protecting you from the rain, his rather grim estimate is you will be the last to burn. So the summary, by way of summary, life was short, often very difficult for the vast majority. The cities were greatly overcrowded. The streets were narrow and dirty, sometimes dangerous as well. There's much writing about crime in the Roman world. Concepts of public and private were very, very different, as I've pointed to. You often bathed and did some of the things we would consider very private were done in full view of the public, or at least with other people present. Very strict social differentiation. Seneca, in one of his letters, is just describing there the reek of the smoking cookers that pour out clouds of ashes and poisonous fumes, and how much better he felt when he left the city. Martial, another writer, a bit like Juvenal, a satirist, lucky enough to have a little farm outside of the city. And he describes how peaceful it is to get away from all the noise of the city that goes on day and night. Juvenal, squalor and the isolation of urban life is immense, compounded by the endless nightmare of fires and collapsing houses. He calls the city cruel and talks about bands of brigands and cutthroats. Often exaggerated a bit, Juvenal, but there's no doubt quite a bit of truth in what he says. So in the estimate of most scholars, about 95% of the population lived around or below the poverty level. We can actually see this in Corinth and in the Corinthian correspondence, where there is a bit of a mixture of domus and insula. That is, of the domus is the more elaborate private homes, the sort that we see at Pompeii. The insula are those great big apartment blocks where the masses live. Phoebe was apparently a patron and must have been resident of one of these larger houses. Gaius as well was able to host the whole church, so presumably was able to or lived in a house large enough to facilitate that. And there are others there. So what made life bearable? Well, the great quote of Juvenal from his satires is, the people are only interested in bread and circuses, that is, in food and entertainment. And what we need to bear in mind when thinking about life in a Roman city is that the public spectacle, or the shows, the theatre, the chariot races, famously the Colosseum and all that went on there, but not just that, but also entertainers in the marketplace, orators and speakers who would travel from place to place, the theatre of the religious festivals and the temple cults. All of these are what made life worthwhile for the inhabitants, and they looked forward, the population very much looked forward to these great and grand occasions, which happened at pretty regular intervals, as sort of making life worthwhile and interesting in some sense. Much of life was lived out in the open in the public space, and that's largely because the vast majority of the population were housed in these very small, very crowded apartment or tenements we call insula. So the home was pretty much just a place to sleep and to store what possessions you might have. Most of the day you lived out in the public arena. You conducted your business in public. You went to the forum, the fountain, the temple. Many of the temples had places to eat where food would be sacrificed and then sold, barbecued, to use modern terms. People would then sit around benches and share the food and, of course, have a bit of fellowship. So you lived a lot of your life outside. In fact, one scholar sort of sums it up really well by saying life in the Roman world is communal living on a grand scale. So the philosophy was that of Horace, carpe diem, rejoice while you are alive, enjoy the day, live life to its fullest, make most of what you have. It is later than you think, pointing to that very short life expectancy that most people experienced. And just a few words to finish with about the rise of Christianity in this social context. Why Christianity made sense in this world. One, it was a community that wasn't closed, as so many of the groups, the cults, the temple cults, the fraternities and so on in the Greco-Roman world were select entry and jealously guarded. The Christian community was open to all, rich and poor, people from all sorts of backgrounds could come and belong, share the rites together, and have fellowship and community together. So we have in the New Testament at many points people who were slaves, people who were freeborn, we have aristocrats, we have those engaged in trade, all entering the community equally through the rite of baptism. There was a prominence of women, especially in the early years and the early decades. And again, historians see this as something that made Christianity quite attractive because women could not only belong but have positions of influence in many of the Christian communities. And we find that reflected in the New Testament. It was a belief system that made sense in a social world that was characterized by a high mortality and a short lifespan. Pagan or non-Christian religions often gave the answer that it's just fate, you couldn't do anything about it, if it was your fate, it was your fate. But Christianity provided an answer to the meaning of life and of the dynamics of life that gave one a bit of hope, most often expressed in terms of a future or otherworldly hope. And the community was often one of care, of compassion, one that preached and had as its ideal love for others. So in very difficult times, which often happened and occurred frequently throughout the Roman world, times of epidemic and plague, times of drought or famine, the Christians often would gather around each other, extend care to the sick, even non-Christian neighbours, family and friends, whether they would be nursing and caring for others in those difficult times, and that often won them great admiration and, of course, more converts to the Christian way. So to sum up, this is Rodney Stark, remember, the historian and sociologist. His summary of why Christianity prevailed, and he means prevailed over Roman paganism in the end. Not all just to do with Constantine and his conversion, but Christianity grew and grew very steadily through the first few centuries because it was a community of inclusiveness. It was a genuine community where people could have a fellowship on a level that was not often experienced elsewhere, of equality. It was a community of compassion where there was genuine and practical care for others. It was a community which preached hope. Finally, and this is the final word, Pliny the Younger, writing to the Emperor Trajan, who was the guy leading the empire in 117 AD, that slide right back at the front, which gave us the context of the Roman world at its greatest extent, at the height of its power. Pliny was a regional governor in Bithynia, present-day Turkey, on the shores of the Black Sea, so a bit inland. He'd come across a group of Christians in his area and he didn't quite know what to do with them. Most scholars date this to about 115 CE or AD, and he describes to the emperor what the Christians do. So this is a very early description of the Christian community by someone outside, that is not by the Christians themselves. Pliny writes that the Christians were accustomed to meet on a fixed day, almost certainly Sunday, before dawn. So those who can't make the 8 o'clock, the real Christians in early times got up before dawn. They sing responsively a hymn to Christ as to a God. Some suggest this might be the Carmen Christi, that hymn to Christ found in Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 to 11. They bind themselves to an oath not to commit some crime, not to commit fraud, theft, or adultery, or falsify their trust. So there's some ethical commitments. And when this was all over, Pliny says they depart. And this would have been because if it was the Sunday, as it certainly was, or almost certainly was, that was a normal work day in the Roman Empire. So the community would meet early morning before the working day began. They would then go off and do their day's work and then come back in the evening to partake of food, but ordinary and innocent food. And this is almost certainly the love feast or the agape meal, perhaps the Eucharist. That's a matter of conjecture and something for another day. So that's the final word on this presentation from Pliny the Younger. I hope it's been of some use and value to you.